Here on this little printmaking block, I have drawn a sea turtle to carve out. I drew it with black Sharpie, and after that, I went over it with orange Sharpie, and that'll help me see my image better and what'll actually print when I carve. I'm using a speedball carver, just a little simple one. I've got 3 gouges for it. I've got a thin one, a thin V-gouge, a kind of wider V-gouge, and I have a U-gouge that's pretty wide. And those are the 3 gouges I'm going to be using, and I'm going to cut this out. And now, when I start cutting, I'm going to cut into the center a little bit. I want to cut into a spot I know there's going to be nothing, just to test it, feel kind of the hardness of the material itself, and get a kind of feel of how hard I'll have to push and how hard I'll have to work to get through it. This is really soft material, so it's going to go pretty fast. Just carving out, leaving those black lines as much as I can. This stuff is actually a little soft to do like really intricate designs. You have to be careful because if you go a little too deep, it can rip. You see how it's ripping into my design a little bit, but just a tad. So you want to press lightly and just cut that fine line off. See, that's coming out a lot better. So you want to just go in a little bit light and go around all your black lines. Now when you're cutting, as much as possible you want to cut away from yourself, because in that scenario it's impossible for you to accidentally cut yourself. If you're accidentally cutting towards yourself, it's easy to slip and poke your fingers. So you want to work away from yourself as much as possible. Best case scenario, you have one hand behind the other, so when you're pushing, it's only going away from you. And if you need to, you can always turn your block. If you need to get into a tight spot, you can always move it around. So that's not really going to be a problem. You want to be as careful as possible, because getting stabbed or poked with one of these guys, it can really hurt. They're very soft. I mean, they're very hard, because even if they're cutting through really fine material, they're also meant to cut through things like linoleum or even wood in some cases. So a lot of these guys can be really, really sharp. And I'm just going in right now and just kind of making a texture for his shell. These don't have to follow the lines exactly perfect, because their shells are kind of imperfect. I have kind of just a rough kind of guideline of what I want the darkness of the shell to be, and then I'm just gonna go in and just kind of let loose. It doesn't have to be phenomenal. See, in this case I am cutting towards myself just a little bit, but it's between my hands, so there's no way I'm gonna slip and hit myself. And now it's getting to the point where I want to if I want to keep going like that, I'm just gonna twist him around so I can work this way. So here, I'm gonna come back in. Gonna make some quick marks. Gonna twist around a little. Get the other side. See? Just making quick work of that shell. When you're doing all this kind of printmaking, you know, don't be afraid to let loose and just kind of let your style of mark making bleed into the print, because it'll show there's a lot of different expressive kind of mark making you can do. You can do, you know, squiggles. You can do all kinds of different hash marks. Like I said, it's kind of tough to do super intricate designs on something as soft as this, but there's still plenty that you can do. This is just going to make a nice little stamp that you can go into and use and put on paper if you like, or other objects even, if you have the right inks for it. I just have a water-soluble Speedball ink that I'm using right now. And this'll hopefully turn out pretty nice. I don't do things on this soft very often, but I think for demoing it's really nice and goes pretty fast. So this is something that really anyone can pick up. You know, these Speedball carvers are pretty cheap, and so are these little print blocks. They're like the consistency of a eraser. They're pretty flexible, and they hold up pretty nicely. I mean, something like a linoleum is gonna hold up a lot longer, and it's kind of a nice medium between this and wood, where you can get some really, really fine detail, but also have it last a little bit longer. Linoleum block will get you can print on it many, many, many times, around like maybe a limit of like 50 before your image really changes, unless you have like super fine detail that's getting rubbed off when you clean it. But if you do it at once, you can get some really good long editions of your prints. But this is definitely a fine thing to start off practicing. It's a nice thing to pick up and just do. They're almost like little like sketches. You can do them so fast. And if it fits your style, then go ahead. There's no reason why this can't actually be a piece in itself. It doesn't have to be just a kind of stamp for you. Yeah, I'm trying some different textures now, just kind of do maybe just straight lines on this one, see how that goes. So I'm cutting out the texture of the shell, but I'm leaving the border so I can make all these long lines as long as I don't go into the actual contour drawing. Then it won't mess anything up. So yeah, once you get a kind of feeling of the texture you want to do, you can just kind of let loose and just go over them without really even thinking. It's a nice little freeing kind of activity where you can just create your own textures that are similar in shade or technique over and over. So I'm just gonna go in real quick and do something like this. See how that goes. Just not really stressing about it. And I think That one looks pretty nice. Maybe one more. Now I'm gonna go in and do the side of his shell. So this is the part that comes down over the stomach. So these are a little rectangular shapes. And how I've shaded them, they're just little dots. So I'm just trying to dodge out most of those dots. And some I'm not going around as perfect. And why I'm wiping it is you don't want to leave little pieces on the piece. So you want to get all those little pieces, like these little bits. If they get stuck in here and you don't notice them, they can mess with the quality of your print because it'll stay on the ink and then cover up part of the image, possibly. So you want to get off as many of those little pieces as possible, the little pieces of the plastic or whatever you're carving. So I'm just double checking and just being careful to get them all off. But I'll clean the block at the end, just with a good, nice wipe down and blowing in the edges. You can use your breath, or you can use a little brush, any kind of thing. Even like a toothbrush if what you're working on is hard enough. If you're doing like a carving on linoleum, it probably is the hardest you want to do that with, but anything that'll get the little pieces out of the corners and ridges. So now I'm gonna kind of move on to this fin. I want to show the contour a bit, so I want to lighten up right around it just to make sure that that fin shape is really clarified. You can definitely tell it's a fin. That is the goal. Otherwise, it's just kind of lost in space. So I came out a little wide here, and that's totally fine at this point because I haven't cut the border yet. It's also another reason why it's good to cut the border last. You can just move out the border just a tiny bit and you'll be able to do that. So just little things like that can help you become more confident, because if you're not really afraid of making mistakes, there's a lot of exciting things that can happen. If you just let go and just let things happen as they happen and just deal with the problems as they come, you can fix a lot of stuff before it even becomes a problem. And with the textures that I'm making, it makes it easier to hide things like going through contour lines a little bit, because it'll make it a little bit easier to see it as just a texture rather than going too hard. Like here, I cut into that border a little too much, but I don't think it'll really show up. If it does, I mean, it's not going to be super noticeable just because of the texture that's around it. So that can be another way to hide things that you don't want the viewer necessarily to see, but you don't want to start over. So again, giving kind of a bold outline. I don't want to do a really light highlight on this side. I don't want to do a bold one. I want to just kind of go in and cut little pieces out. So there's little spots that are going to stay black on this. So everything that I'm not cutting out is going to be black. I'm just going to use straight black ink. So here, I'm just going to, and my hand is clear off to the side. I'm just coming off with these and coming in from the side here, getting these pieces. Getting a nice little texture there. Some of those are having a little trouble coming out. And I like that texture, so I'm gonna come in and actually see if I can do a little bit over here. It's not quite doing the same thing, but the idea is there. I think that little bit of repetition is kind of nice. Okay, so I'm gonna do the back fin now. Here I'm just gonna kind of, so this one is actually gonna be kind of dark, I think, being in the background. So I'm gonna leave it kind of dark, mostly in shadow. Now, the face, I guess. Now, the eye that I'm wanting to work on is gonna be a circle. So the best way to do this is to turn the block. Now I'm lightly pushing with my hand and turning the block so I can get a pivot point and get, if not a circle, a pretty close circle if it wants to come out. Or it wasn't exactly a circle. I wanted to do a little bit of an eye shape, but so it's a round shape, so I just turned my block, and that allowed me to get with the pivot point to get a really nice curve, and a natural curve. If you try and do it with your hand, you can do a natural curve. It's just a lot harder. That curve is not as perfect as this one on the inside. But with practice, you can do it. The key is to kind of follow that motion. So just curve your arm like you're curving the block, but without moving it, you're curving your arm instead. With just a little bit of practice, I think you'd be able to get that down pretty fast. It just makes it a little easier on yourself if you turn the block, especially with engraving and things like that. When the material's a lot harder. On something like this, it's a lot easier because you don't really have to put as much pressure into it, and you're not worried about slipping as much. When your material is harder, you have to worry a little bit more about slipping, and then that's when cutting yourself becomes a lot more dangerous, when your material is harder. Wood, if your hand's at the wrong angle and you push too hard, you can slide real fast into your hand, and that is no fun. I can personally attest to that. But something like this is really easy. You don't have to worry. The biggest thing you have to worry about is cutting too deep with it being too soft like this, and that's when when you finish the cut, if you cut too deep like I did, and then you pull up, you see how it kind of ripped a lot right there? It ripped out that piece there, and it cut into the border on 2 of these. So you got to be careful about that when you're working with things that are too soft. So with this and linoleum, you'd want to have to worry about that. So since I did that, I'm going to just pull out this border again, just a little bit, and it's fine again. So another way to fix that up a little bit. Alright, so now I've totally cut out my sea turtle. Well, I'm gonna come in here a little bit and lighten this area up. It's a little too much black, I think, or a little too dark. Whatever color you choose to use, I think it's a little too much. So here, now I'm gonna do kind of a bolder outline. So I did this all with the smallest V gouge. Now I'm gonna switch it. These kind of twists, and then that blade just comes right out. Put it in a safe spot. And I'm gonna go up to the number 2 V gouge. tighten this up, make sure it's tight. Now this is gonna be a wider cut because it can go deeper. That is the point. And then that is a nice clean line around it. Now, use the V point of this to your advantage. When you have a V shape like this, you can start the cut right there, and you can kind of use that natural V to get a nice cut there on right angles to get a nice clean line that doesn't have any kind of square in it or rounded form. I'm gonna come back, cut into this, and now we have a border. I'm double cutting on that side just to make that transition from line to line just a little bit easier. And now I'm gonna cut closer just a little bit to his mouth, like that. Cutting around his shell now. So in this situation, I cut a little too wide. I was focusing more on the curve rather than the cut itself. So I'm just gonna widen that up a little bit, right there, take it down to the line, and just even this out. It doesn't matter how bold the border is, I just want it to be even. So I'm gonna come in and make it kind of a gradual transition from one border to the next. So it's a little bit wider on the arm, but it goes from thin to kind of thicker to the thickest right there. And that's gonna be okay. I think that'll look nice. And the thing is about something like this in printmaking, you can always cut out your image and then test print it. And we'll be doing that later, but yeah, test printing and then coming back and deciding what is good and what's not and what you want to keep. You can always retest it. So here, I'm almost done with my border. I'm on my second leg. Now going to the back of the turtle, cut that out pretty fast. And here, you can do a pretty successful line turning the block as well while you're turning it, if you're pretty confident and you feel like you can do that. But just takes practice. If you're not getting it right away, it's alright. You can always flip it over, try it on the other side, or redraw it smaller, try it again, or practice the technique and then come back to your actual design. So if you had something really complex in the center that you wanted to practice, you could draw it out on the corner, something that you didn't that you knew you weren't going to use, and you can practice cutting it out there, and then you can also see what the texture looks like too. So it's a little bit of a win-win. It's always a good idea to get some practice in. That's why I suggested cutting in the center where you knew there was going to be nothing, just so you can get a sense of how hard the block is and how easy it'll be to cut. So here, I finished that last cut, and I want this to be a little bit sharper, so I'm going to do the thing that I did for the corners, where you use the natural V-gouge shape, and you get a little bit of a point there. I'm going to finish that up, and then this guy is ready to print. Yeah. Alright. We'll get to printing. So here, to start printing, I'm just gonna add a little bit of ink there. Spread that out just a little bit. Now, I've made a little bit of a line about the size of my brayer. So, with this, you're going to start spreading it out, and you're going to make a square with it. So you want to make an even square. You want the coating to be pretty even. You want it to be even over your brayer. Like there's a little bit of a texture to it. That's fine. What you're looking for is that it's even throughout. So if it's textured, you want to make sure it's textured across the whole brayer. Okay, so now we have a loaded brayer, we have a loaded brayer with ink, and we have our square, which is where we're going to reload it. And I have my block over here to the side, like this. And now, I'm going to roll it up onto there. Now, for the most part, it's covering pretty nicely. I think it's going to be able to cover in one go. I don't think I'm going to have to reload this at all. So I'm just going to go over this and make sure I have it all. So I want to go in different directions, covering the whole thing. Now, if you look closely, it looks like there's some spots that didn't quite take, like in the corner. And that can be a problem with the ink, or that can be an inconsistency in the block itself. So not every block is gonna be perfectly straight, and you know, it happens. It's life. But I think that is as close as it's gonna get. And you want to get in pretty close so you can tell if there's something a little bit off. You can tell by the texture of the thing. It'll have a little bit of a texture. It'll be a little bit. You want it to be glossy over the entire thing. So just moving it over in the light, you can tell that it's completely saturated in ink, and evenly so. Looking at it, I actually notice there's a little shaving right there. I'm gonna see if I can get it off. That way, if I would have left that there, it would have left a white spot where I don't want a white spot. So I scraped that off, but now I've kind of moved that ink around. So I'm just gonna go over that spot again and see if I can just... So the whole key to getting things even again in a case like that is just repetition. You want to go over it, and as your ink reloads, your brayer will evenly spread out the ink again. You just have to make sure to go over the whole thing multiple times and in order. Alright, so that looks pretty good. I think that's about as good as we're gonna get. I don't see any more little pieces. If there are any, I don't see them. And now I'm gonna move this block so I can move this to the center. And I have a little piece of test print paper. I'm just gonna kind of eyeball this for you. And I'm gonna just evenly rub it. You can use all kinds of tools. There's hand tools, Barons, that are specifically made for hand printing, and those are, great. You can always use your hands, and if you don't want to use your hands and you can't get a Baron, anything really works. Like, you can use the back end of this Sharpie that you use to draw with. Now with this is on something that'll squish, so you don't want to go too hard. You just want to make sure you get the whole image over and over again, so you don't want to press too hard that you're gonna smush the ink. Alright, let's see how that turns out. And there we go. That looks pretty good, huh? Looks alright. That's maybe a little bit annoying. I don't quite mind it. I like prints that are a little imperfect. They have a little bit more character. If you wanted to do a fine art print, you can always redo it and keep doing it. And yeah, I think that came out pretty nice. Alright, thanks for tuning in.